Okay, let's take a look at the World Bank Development Indicators database, and let's fit that into our data frame, which ultimately has to be a stacked time series. And what you see is we downloaded the data, and your data should look similar to mine, if not identical. So we have two sheets. One has the data, but it's in a list and not in columns as we wanted. And we have the series metadata, which contains, again, brief information on what kind of variables we downloaded, what their definitions are, how the World Bank classifies them, and so on. So the first thing that probably bothers you is the fact that the cell content doesn't really fit the cells. So to remedy that, we typically want to highlight the entire worksheet by clicking on that little left triangle on the left corner here. And then we can click anywhere between the column names A, B, C, D and double click, and that will automatically fit the content. So if I double click, it fits the content. We can do the same for the series metadata, and I fit the content. So now we want to build a data set. What is always a good strategy is to say, okay, here in the sheet called data, this is the original data that we downloaded. It is always good to keep a copy of the original data and just copy the entire data set into a new worksheet that you give a different name. So I typically give it my name, so I know I worked on that one. And now you see that my keystrokes are being recorded, which I hope will help you, or my keystrokes, they are shown, because you need to develop a lot of keystroke skills, especially Control, Shift, and Arrow, in order to see how to navigate around a data set. So what we want to do is we just highlight our entire data set, the original data. So you see I pressed Control, Shift, Arrow right, and now I press Control, Shift, Arrow down, and I highlight all the filled cells. What is important is that you really just play around with it. It is difficult to explain in words. You have to sit in front of a data set and play around with those commands. So let's do it again. Control Shift, Arrow right and down, highlights everything. Then I press Control C for copy, and then I just paste it. I right click now the mouse, paste special, values, and now we have it here. And we fit everything again to content by, we can highlight everything like here and click between the columns. And now we see our data set. So how does our data set look like? So first of all, it is nicely as a list. But if we look closer, we see the first country is Afghanistan, and the second country is that will be Albania, but it comes really down the data set. And what you see is that if we look at the data, the first variable is GDP per capita. And now for Afghanistan, we start again with 1960 with the next variable, which is total natural resource rents. So this is not a stacked time series for all the countries. What this is actually a stacked cross-section. And this is not what we want. What we want is that once we reach for GDP per capita, the last observation for Afghanistan, the next observation has to be the next country, which is Albania, and we start again with the 1960 value for the next country, which is Albania. So the way we download the data from the WDI is not a stacked time series, it is actually a stacked cross-section. And so what we want to do is we want to actually sort our data by that series code. And I always recommend that if you go to the metadata first and you highlight all the metadata, and then we sort already by that code. So we click on data, sort, and we want to sort by that code. Okay, so nothing has changed because that code was already in alphabetical order. In the next step, we do now the same thing. We highlight our data set and we sort also by series code. So this series code is the same as in the metadata. So now what has changed? If we go to the end, the last observation of Afghanistan, you see that Albania still works or still shows GDP per capita. So the first stacked time series is GDP per capita for Afghanistan. And then comes the next time series, which is Albania. And then comes the next country, which is Algeria. And the last one will be Zimbabwe. And then we start again with Afghanistan. But then we will have the next variable, which according to our sorting will be total natural resource runs. And this is how we want to sort our data, which is a stacked time series. So let's go and find the next place where it says Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is obviously up here, but then it moves to Albania, and I know that the last observation in the data set is Zimbabwe, so I can Control F and search, for example, for Zimbabwe. And now we see, this is the first observation for Zimbabwe in 1960 for GDP per capita. So let's go to the end. And now we see, here we have again Afghanistan, but now we start with the next series, which is total natural resource runs. And I can keep on going down. Let's say I search again for the next Zimbabwe. So that is the last stacked time series for Zimbabwe regarding total natural resource runs. And you see at the end we have now again school enrollment. Okay, so now we have sorted our data the way we wanted. And what we know is that the first value here is Afghanistan 1960 GDP per capita. Okay, so this is GDP per capita, call it GDP per cap. Then we know that the next series we want is total natural resource runs, and actually it makes more sense to find good abbreviations. So what I do is I insert a column between the indicator name or after the indicator name, and I call that column abbreviation. So I call GDP per capita small y, which is how economists typically abbreviate GDP per capita. Natural resource rents I call NRR. Then school enrollment, GPI, I just call the gender parity index, GPI. And poverty headcount I just call poverty. So now what I do is I just highlight those 1, 3, 4 observations. I press Control C, I copy it, and I go to my data set, and I paste special. So I click into this cell where I want to paste special. I right click, and I go to this transpose function, which means transpose means that the column is inserted as a row. And now you see we have here Y, natural resource rents, GPI, and poverty as our abbreviations. Okay, but of course we don't have any values yet where it says NRR and GPI and poverty. But because we sorted the data as a nice stacked time series, if you just scroll down a little bit and I search again maybe for Afghanistan, and AFG should be enough, then we see, here we have now the total natural resource rents beginning again with Afghanistan. And the sequence of countries will always be the same because it was downloaded from a data set, so the data set has always the same format in terms of the countries. And so now I just highlight the entire column beginning from total natural resource rents down. So I press Shift, Control, arrow down, or Control Shift, arrow down. Now I press Control X, which means I copy the entire column. And now I go one to the right, and now I press Control Shift, arrow up, arrow down, and now I press Control D. Control D means copy down. Sorry, I should have done Control V. Oops. Okay, let's do it again. Okay, so we go to where it says total natural resource rents, or I search again for Afghanistan. Okay, so let's do it again. So I highlight the entire column with Control Shift, arrow down. Now I press Control X. I go one arrow right, Control arrow up, arrow down, and now it is Control V for paste. Okay, so now we got it. Okay, but now you see, I copied now not only the column that includes natural resource rents, but also GPI and poverty. But I know that my column Y, if I go down to the last filled cell, which is the cell before I started to cut out the data set, there is some overshoot in the column to the right. Well, what I know is that the column so this is still, column G is still Y. Natural resource rents I already copied. But there is still more to it. And I know that this cell here, which is cell H 13,239, this is the first observation again for Afghanistan regarding our third variable, which is the gender parity index. So I cut again the entire column. I go one to the right, I go up, and I go under the gender parity index, and I press again Control V. And again, I should have some overshoot because I still need the poverty variable. Well, where do I find the poverty variable? I go again to the last filled cell of the previous column, and I can identify here again the overshoot. And again, the cell I 13,239, that is again the first entry for our poverty indicators. And I'll just cut again this column, Control X, I go one to the right, Control arrow up, arrow down, Control V, and now we have all our first variables. nicely sorted the way it is supposed to be, meaning that for each variable we have a column. So we have now one column for Y, one column for natural resource rent, one column for GPI, one column for poverty. But we still need to clean up the data set a little bit. So for one, I know that the last row of my data set is 13,238 because everything below I cut out the rows from the list. So I can now highlight and delete everything which is below the row 13,238. I just highlight everything and go all the way down and just delete everything. Okay. So this is very important. You have to download and make sure that your data is downloaded as a list. Then you sort by series name. And then you can conveniently copy the list into one column after the other. You always have to make sure that you take that overshoot from the columns and always move it to the right, just as we have hopefully seen. So now let's clean up the data set a little bit more. So we have the country name. Let's just call it country because you want to keep it short and simple. Maybe country code. We'll just call it code. We actually don't need this column C anymore, series name, because GDP per capita we already copied, or we already have it in column G. So I can actually delete that. The series code, that's not really that important. We don't need that either. The time, I prefer to call that year. And now I delete everything in time code and I replace it by ID. And now I delete all those years because it is pretty much the same in column D as in column C, except that column D has like YR in front of it, which you don't really need. So let's delete this column and we replace it by an ID. And we want the ID to be AFG 1960 and then AFG 1961. And obviously that is not a particularly efficient way, because by the time I reach row 13,238, quite some time will have elapsed. So what we need to do is we use a simple formula in Excel, which is concatenate. And whenever we enter a formula in Excel, we press equal. And then all we say is we want to concatenate the country code, AFG, and the year. Enter. And that will take care of it. Okay. And then I highlight again all the remaining rows. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to press here now Control Shift arrow down, because then we go down to a million rows that are irrelevant. What we want to do is we only want to highlight the column until the last filled row of our data set. So I go to the last row of my data set, then I go under the column where I want to copy down. Now I press Control Shift arrow up. So now that highlights everything. And now I want to copy down that formula AFG 1960. And you can copy down easily with Control D. And that copies it down. sometimes you download data and you enter a formula and you will realize that even though you entered equals B2 and C2, nothing happens. Whenever you encounter this problem, what you need to do is you highlight the entire data set, you right-click, you go to Format Cells, and then you make sure that you click on General. I don't know why that is. That's just the way it is. So whenever you feel that a formula is not really understood, make sure you highlight the entire data set, right-click, Format Cells, make sure you click on General, and then OK. Another thing that is important, we have used here a formula. You know, it says here equals B 13,238 and the ampersand sign and cell and column C and then row 13,223. So we have here 13,000 formulas essentially in there. Once you are done with a formula, because formulas take up a lot of memory, and sometimes they can cause your program to crash, what you want to do is you want to take out the formula. So how do you take out the formula? You highlight again the entire column, Control-Shift arrow down, then you press Control-C, and then you can right-click with the mouse anywhere, and you go to Paste Special. You can go to Paste Special and click here Value, or you just right-click and paste Special, and you click on that little 1, 2, 3 sign, which is Values, and now you will see that the formula has disappeared. And now we have only a string essentially in here. Okay, so this will be our data frame. We have for all the countries, for all the variables, we have stacked time series for all the countries. So the first time series is always Afghanistan, followed by Albania. It's always a time series, and we stack those time series. And the last one is Zimbabwe. You still can try to format maybe your data set a little bit. So you want to make sure that maybe you fit everything again to content. Maybe you want to highlight the first row, make it bold. Maybe beginning from code, you want to maybe center your data so you can highlight everything and then right-click and then Format Cells. There is like the center icon. You have here a lot of decimals maybe that you don't find too attractive, so we can take out maybe some of the decimals. So you highlight again the entire data set, right-click, and then you see in this menu there's like the option to decrease decimals. So we can do that, and now you could hear, aha, that didn't work. So whenever that happens, you want to make sure that those cells that you want to turn into decimals, make sure that they are a number. So you right-click again, format the cells, make sure there's a number. And so at the moment, I can say I'm at 8 decimal places. Now I don't like it. Now I can right-click again, and I can use this little shortcut up here, decrease decimals. And typically you don't want more than 3. For some variables like GDP per capita, I mean, decimals are not particularly meaningful, so maybe we want to take them out there completely. And So now we have no decimals there. And what I don't recommend is that you use the thousand separator. It is sometimes useful for certain purposes, but I noticed that sometimes when you upload data with a thousand separator, it's not necessarily read by a software program. So I would not recommend to use thousand separators. What is not a problem is to have fewer decimals, because even if you upload an Excel sheet into a statistical software analysis program, it will read in the entire number, not only the ones that you have, not only the ones with the reduced decimals. So reducing decimals is not an issue. Having thousand separators, I noticed, can be sometimes an issue, and I would advise not to use it. But now we have pretty much our data frame, so a stacked time series, and this will be our template for all the other variables that we download. So we still have other variables like the Gini coefficient and health data from the Institute of Health Metrics. So we will all add them to this template here. So we will have here, beginning from column I and J and later more, we will add more variables. Okay, so I know it is a fast video, and but what is important is that you see the end result, and ultimately you have to somehow sit down and just practice. And you will make mistakes, that's fine. Whenever you blow up your data set, you can always go back to the original, that's why you saved it. But ultimately you need to develop muscle memory, which is difficult to teach, because ultimately that is something that you need to do by yourself. All right, so this is how we clean up the World Bank Development Indicators database. I hope that was useful. Thanks.